Ali, thank you very much indeed for coming onto this podcast. Um, it's actually a little bit of a follow-up because we've actually had a private conversation offline about brand and marketing. And the reason I did that was I was super impressed with the branding and work that you've done for the 7:45 Breakfast Club. And then we started talking about storytelling and brand. And the more I listened to you, the more I learnt, the more I became curious and I wanted to explain further and understand more and see how these things work. Because I think brand and reputation and marketing are all part of storytelling and they're all part of human connection. And so for somebody who's in the business of human connection, I think you're a really interesting person to listen to and learn from. Do you want to share a little bit about your story and how you got into brand and marketing?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much, Tim. So my name's Ali McDonald. I once I graduated university studying graphic design. I came back to Jersey, planning only for the summer before heading back to the mainland, but ended up securing a job and didn't quite manage to get away after that. I joined a local agency, one of the biggest agencies, Pan Island agencies in the Channel Islands at the time. And then I was there through a merger for just under 10 years before COVID hit and the office I was in closed subsequently. So six of us were made redundant. And it was at that point I decided to strike out on my own, something I'd been considering for a number of years, but never quite brave enough to take the leap. And with the market as it was the time to set up. A couple of clients came with me, and I've been doing that now for the last three and a half years. So, yeah, started in the agency as a junior straight out of university, where I would turn my hand to everything and anything. Uh, at the time, there was a lot more print work than digital, and then over the years, that is crept and altered and completely reversed in the end. Uh, and so yeah, very disciplinary background, and then I took that when I set out on my own. I took that sort of ethos. I can do a multitude of design tasks. So anything any client wanted, I could turn my hand to. But then, really, as I've sort of grown and learned, you really do need those foundations to understand the company, where it's coming from, what it wants to achieve, and that's where I found the brand and the brand strategy side of design and the thought process behind it is so key to anything you produce. So whereas we'd be designing off a brief and then presenting it to a client and they're like, this isn't quite right, I'm not sure, this isn't what I want, I'll know it when I see it. If you go back a few steps and have those conversations about what they actually want to achieve from the outset, that's where it's a lot clearer for a designer to make those decisions based on those outcomes that are required, before having to go through iterations and iterations where maybe the initial concept of the design is eventually lost and watered down to sort of insignificant. So yeah, brand strategy and design has to be at the key and the starting point, I think, for most designs, if not all designs.
And that's really useful, particularly coming from a multidisciplinary approach. I think uh, many people, myself included, at first put sales, marketing, brand all in the same bucket. And actually, there are clear distinctions between them. And in our previous conversation, and indeed, as you've just alluded to, you're much more aligned to the organization's strategy and its values than actually a particular product. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so your marketing, once you've developed your brand foundation and brand strategy, uh, will relate to your product and your sales. But without that first initial stage of what you're all about, what you stand for, your vision, your values, your mission, you really can lose your way. And it's like firing messages out into the ether, and really just hoping they land in front of the right people, whereas being a lot more targeted about who you're approaching, who your ideal customer is, who they are, where they appear online, particularly, and really sort of targeting them gives you a lot higher rate of success. Finding those people who align with your mission and your vision and your values, and then it's not so much as trying to sell to them as this is what we do. We know you buy into it, and bringing them along for the journey and creating that sort of community of customers.
And I find that really interesting because, of course, there are many people who are very familiar with Simon Sinek and his book Start With Why.
Yeah.
But of course, what you're doing there is starting with who. Really know your customer, know who they are. Maybe then, when you know who they are, you can explain and explore their why. But it really has to start with who. And I'm very struck by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of alongside the defining who is the company's why.
Mhm.
Why do you do it? Yeah, you do. You need that why as well. But really, when it comes to finding out who you're talking to, it really makes it a lot more targeted and strategic.
One of the things that we touched on when we met for a coffee and a chat, and it really left an impression upon me, is the point that this connection, this why, as well as this who, your audience, how important that is. And the excellent example you gave was Nike, who talk about just do it. They have a set of values and they have a set of beliefs, but they don't go around everywhere saying we sell shoes. In fact, the one thing that you'll see in all their advertisements doesn't necessarily focus on the shoes. It will focus on the athlete. It will focus on success. It will focus on endeavor and effort. And the shoes is almost best supporting actor. And I was really struck by that aspect of brand marketing. And I'm just interested in your views about, how important is a product compared to the brand?
Yeah. So with Nike is a great example. They have had that ethos and vision from day one and they implement it every single day in everything they do. Being on the front foot, driving forward, relentless, not stopping. They don't stand around and talk about things. They eat, sleep, and breathe it, and their actions speak louder than words. And then the subsequent products that they produce follow that ethos. And they have when you're a fan of Nike or any of the big brands, Adidas, whoever it might be, once you buy into their brand, that is who you are with. And a lot of people will not have their heads turned to competitors because they eat, sleep, and breathe the brand and everything that they stand for. It's a really good example.
If we take, for example, celebrity endorsements, and the really big brands will go for that. And Usain Bolt, I believe, would put on a pair of gold Nikes before doing the 100 meters. So to a certain extent, there was an element of product focus there. But of course, people are really identifying with Usain Bolt, the fastest man on earth. And the power of celebrity endorsement is so powerful that we will now end up paying a disproportionate amount of money for that shoe, way beyond actually its technical value in materials, manufacture, and cost. And so what we're actually doing is we're bypassing our entire critical thinking and making an emotional decision. And I'm curious about that idea that we bypass critical thinking and make emotional decisions. Now, I'm not for one moment advocating that you should knock up a spreadsheet when you're choosing your significant other in life. I think there is a time and a place for emotions. But actually, when it comes to purchases, the idea that you make emotional purchases or even spontaneous ones without any critical thinking, I think is a really interesting one.
It really is interesting, but I So that's a really interesting point. It gets to a point where products are doing the same thing. Let's take a car, for example. They all get you from A to B. Why do we pick one brand over another? Yes, I mean there are differences in their spec and different certain levels of comfort possibly. But like as you say, the value of them is completely disproportionate to some of the prices that we'll pay for certain brands over others. And it's a great example of where you position yourself within the market can dictate what fee you can choose for your product or service. So that's where the power of brand can be really, really clearly defined. If we all made those critical thinking decisions based purely on facts, we would all pick the most economical car that gets us from A to B, that is safe. But no, we all want a BMW or a Mercedes or some of these higher end brands, and then you're onto your Rolls Royces as well and Bentley, because they do bring with that status symbol and what it says about us as a consumer having one of those products, those vehicles. So yeah, it's definitely, they get to a point where brand plays a much bigger part. So the smaller businesses that are out there, their brand needs to be based on energy and what they eat, sleep, and breathe and do. Whereas the larger brands, it's maybe more what they say and how they make the customer feel as well.
And
To
does that not present a real challenge for organizations like yours? Because clearly, if everyone's going for premium quality, prestige, then actually it becomes increasingly difficult to actually have a unique identity because you're all actually going to try and be clones of each other. Everyone's trying to be BMW, everyone's trying to be Porsche. And when everyone tries to be different, we all end up kind of looking the same because we're following the same trajectory, same end, same objective. We are mimicking these things, we're cloning these things. You know, how do you, when you're working with an organization, help them achieve their ends without just creating a clone?
That's a great question. It's all comes down to conversation. It's where I really bring it back to forging those conversations and talking to business owners and senior leadership and finding out more about that company and what makes it different. When you're in the day to day and you know that business inside out, it's sometimes a bit harder to have that fresh perspective and see where those differences actually lie. And you can end up just start blending down your brand, and you do, and then they do all sort of merge and start to look very similar. So the real skill is to sort of step back and discover what does make you different. Can you stand out from the crowd, and how can you accentuate that? Who are you trying to talk to that will appreciate those differences and be willing to pay for those differences? And then really sort of putting that all together to come up with a brand that you can roll out internally and externally. So that is your voice, that is how you look, you feel, you eat, sleep, and breathe. Just like the Nike ethos of just do it. It's ingrained into everything that they do.
And I'm interested in that because I think sometimes having an external perspective, you will see things that perhaps the client doesn't even see within themselves. And I'm not necessarily asking you to sort of name clients, but I would really value you sharing some of the discoveries that you've made when you're talking with clients, those points where you notice something that's really very different.
Yeah, certainly. So it's when clients are thinking along the lines of we are we are a financial institution and these are our products and this is what we do and this is how we do it, where really you need to sort of, and it removes any sort of human element of it. You've got to get into that business and see how it works, see where their real customer service comes in and how they handle their customers and what their customers appreciate as well. So there's an awful lot of research that goes into it, where their customers come from. There can be an element of research into asking their customers what they appreciate about their company, and sometimes that will give you insights that the company wouldn't have been able to tell you in a month of Sundays, just because they're too close. They sort of almost overlook what they could deem as insignificant, and it's those sort of golden nuggets that you can really then take and start to build a brand around. Do they appreciate that customer service, or is it the quick efficiency? It doesn't necessarily have to be the hand holding element. We are direct, we are to the point, and we get you results. It's finding those real small like nuances that sometimes companies just sort of overlook and don't give the attention that they really need to.
And I think that one of the things that's particularly interesting about that is as you gain an insight to what the customer's actually buying, as opposed to what the company's selling, because curiously they can be different. The company is selling widgets, the customer's buying convenience. And there's that great phrase, don't sell the steak, sell the sizzle. But I imagine that must lead you sometimes into product development or identifying products that better align with the brands and maybe those products that don't fit. Has that been your experience?
So there is definitely an element of that, and when the project sort of creeps, scope creep goes into sort of more of their wider offering, and as it should, the brand should, once the branding exercise has been completed, it's how it then gets implemented throughout the business. It should impact across the board everything it does. It should become a foundation of everything that the employees do, and be the face of the company and all things it does.
And that's a particularly challenging but vitally important thing, this idea of alignment. I think some of the sort of road crashes that we've seen in brand and marketing is where you say one thing and do another. And if you're all about quality, then, every component needs to be quality. But if you're about price, then we expect everything to be cut to the minimum. And we can quickly differentiate between, say, Ryanair, which is a valuable product, but is very clear about its target market and its brand, compared to, say, Emirates. Completely different airline serving completely different public with different expectations. So do you then find yourself, we said there's an element of scope creep sometimes when you start looking at the products, but then inevitably you start looking at the alignment.
Yeah. So as part of the exercise, you do need a rollout phase where, especially around bigger organizations, how do you get that buy-in? I think this is commonly missed or skipped, where brands have been done at a higher level and then they are just unveiled to their staff and employees, and they are as confused. It has the opposite effect of what you want. You want it to unite, to bond, but if it's skimmed over, nobody really knows what this new brand, whether it's a rebrand or a completely new brand, is all about, and how do you relate to it? How do you then go on to embody this brand? So there is a phase where you need to go within the business, and how are you going to get buy-in to this from employees? Because they're fundamentally on the front line, have to eat, sleep, and breathe and embody this brand now. And it is definitely it's a very fine tightrope sometimes to walk, because some people are very set in their ways and they like the way they've done things and think they are doing a tremendous job, and they may well have been. But with the bigger picture being looked at and where the company wants to go, it may be a slightly different trajectory from where it was previously or years gone by. So it's a really important time to invest in that and get the buy-in from employees and frontline staff.
And one of the things, I mean, a lot of this is kind of motherhood and apple pie to me, because I'm effectively a process guy. I'm interested in outputs and outcomes. I'm used to working in measures and achievement and goals. But when you talk about confusion, I find that interesting, because one of the things that I personally find a little bit more challenging is the aesthetic side. And yet, of course, the aesthetics can be sometimes the most important thing. A picture speaks 1,000 words, and actually, sometimes your choice of font, your choice of color, your choice of positioning, um, these are not incidental. These are quite profound. What is the thinking that goes into that?
There is a great amount of thinking and thought that goes into all of those visual elements. And often when people are talking about brand, they think straight away about colors, color palettes, and type choices, logos, and that's the visual element of a brand. Yes, it's what the first thing that a lot of customers see when experiencing a brand, but it all has been considered to a great depth, and it all works and should be embodying that brand and reinforcing the message that the company is now trying to put across. And I suppose the confusion element that can come is when it is dropped on people with no sort of explanation or idea of what all the thinking that's gone into it. If you're just given a new logo and then possibly a name on a rebrand, it's like, oh well, we're now called this, but why are we called this? What does this mean and entail for me, for the customers, for the products, for the future of the company? It can be quite unsettling. So there's work to be done with the new brand, but also through marketing and internal comms of explaining this to employees and the wider customers that that's usually covered, but the people who are really trying to embody these brands' values need to have it explained. It's not, they won't just get it overnight, especially if they're trying to then reinforce it and express it to customers.
Now, I'm really interested in that. Let's explore that because there are different views. I can see both sides to this argument, but they're quite different arguments. So anyone who's watched Lord Sugar on The Apprentice will know that his approach to branding is name the product 50 times in 50 seconds and I'm happy. Don't do anything too arty that leaves me thinking, what was that about? But of course, I'm struck by what you're saying that sometimes we actually do need to explain the brand. Now, there's currently, for example, and this only kind of fits with people watching this in our local jurisdiction, but there's an advertisement for Andrex toilet roll where the advertisement seems to focus on everything except the toilet roll. And we've seen similar. And I'm just really interested in that because I can see that it may be entertainment, but is it information? If you're left at the end of it needing to have it explained to you, has it worked?
So the explanation element, I suppose I am talking particularly to internal employees. I mean, an advertisement needs to be understood by the audience in the very few seconds that you've got to make an impact and get their attention and get them to carry out the desired outcome. The explanation, I think, is when you've potentially been working somewhere for a number of years or even a short time, and you think you understand the company that you're in and what they're about. If you are looking to rebrand and it's just done with no sort of thought for the people who are on the ground, it can have a negative effect. It can really sort of unsettle people. It's like, so who are we now? Why are we doing this? Has that changed? And if it has, it really does need to be explained what you now stand for, why you've made those choices. It's so important. It's sort of sometimes a forgotten step, and it can sort of undo all the hard work that's gone in the background just because you've missed that step and not getting the people to on the same page, I suppose. Yeah.
And are there increasingly cultural issues? Now, as part of another podcast, an observation was made by Tim Nash, who was saying that when Cameron went to China trying to open up new markets and secure funding in British infrastructure, he did it during Remembrance Week, and therefore he was wearing a poppy to honor those that had fought. But of course, poppies mean something completely different to the Chinese, who were oppressed by the British, the imperial state during the Opium Wars. And so he's wearing a poppy for his reasons that has a meaning for him. For his Chinese guests, that symbol had a completely different meaning. And I imagine when you're increasingly across jurisdictions, and of course we have multiculturalism within the workplace as well, it becomes increasingly important to be sensitive to these things. How do you manage that within brand and marketing without ending up being a bit bland?
Indeed, yeah, that is definitely always a consideration. And it's very difficult until you are aware and have that knowledge. It can be so easy to be overlooked. So again, having those open, honest dialogues with companies and leaders within those companies, considering all those facets, and not whether it's on a global scale or even a local scale, of the pain points that other customers, staff might be considering within those decisions, has to be taken into account. And there's no real way of bypassing it or cheating it. It is a literal living and having that life experience, having that awareness that those sorts of decisions can be difficult to have with certain people and staff, and it's customers. It's got to be considered, but there's no real quick and easy way to fix that. It's really comes down to having that awareness, I suppose, and having those conversations.
And one of the things that comes from this conversation is an understanding that actually it perhaps looks as simple as sticking a nice label onto a product, but actually there's a huge amount of investment of time, of knowledge, of understanding that really has to happen first. And I think perhaps we oversimplify by thinking it is about the packaging rather than the product, but actually quite a lot of work goes into that packaging that reflects the values of the product.
Completely, it's the final the end product that people see, customers, staff, colleagues within the business, is the tip of the iceberg. The amount of work that goes on in the background, and the considerations, and the testing, the research, the discovery phase of trying to really understand the business and work out how it all fits together, and where the pain points are, and what the real challenges are within the business, within a branding exercise, is huge. It's much bigger than I think a lot of people give it credit for, and it's something that is quite difficult to bring to people's knowledge, I suppose. So hopefully, if somebody takes that away from this, it's branding exercises, and when you just see what's produced and how much it's cost, it can seem really, really disproportionate of the value that company's got. But when it's done correctly, and the amount of depth that should be gone into through these exercises, it's money well spent, in my opinion. Especially, but then also needs that execution, that follow through to carry it out and roll it out throughout a business. Is so important.
And you're also a consumer. We're all consumers, particularly in the global economy. Which brands stand out for you as a consumer? Because obviously you're going to have an awareness that most of us don't have when you look to the brands. So in your judgment, which are great brands that you sit there and think, actually, I always buy X because of its branding?
Well, so it's not necessarily a brand that I maybe purchase very often, but I think Red Bull
Mhm.
is an excellent example of having a brand ethos and really, really following through with it. Fundamentally, a drinks company, and the way they invest in different sports, extreme sports particularly, slightly less popular sports perhaps as well. I mean, I know they've got into football, but where they do the Red Bull racing with and the extreme sports, the winter sports, I think they absolutely smash it. and it's not, and their visual element is being very consistent. It's not about changing colors or color palettes and updating logos, but really sort of what is our brand, what do we stand for, and following through with it, living it. It's not all about clever marketing campaigns, but they know very clearly who they are and what they stand for, and they do it. They walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Another one is recently Liquid Death, the drinks company, the water company, sorry, is a fantastic way of they have broken into the market, the water market, where you previously mentioned fundamentally you're all trying to do the same thing, very similar products. They have the same products, but they've set out about and how can we stand out? How can we look different? Appeal to a younger audience, and really jump off the shelves. So as well as the cans, their artwork, their style of advertising is brilliant. So another one that I'm definitely enjoying at the moment.
And one of the challenges is that fashions change, and that, I suppose, on occasion necessitates a rebrand or relaunch. But equally, there are those brands that have actually managed to weather changes of fashion and priority. And if we look at the fashion, the clothing market in particular, there do appear to be increasingly challenges around sustainability. Increasingly, we have consumers that value different things, but potentially conflicting things. We have really fast fashion where we want to have clothes, new and different clothes all of the time, but at the same time, we really worry about sustainability, the climate, sweatshops, fair labor, fair pricing. How do you navigate branding in a world of so many different priorities and sometimes actually conflicting priorities?
Yeah, so I don't think brand should be really affected by fashions and trends really, at a much base beginner level. Is you decide on who you are, what you stand for, and where you want to go. They don't change, fundamentally. The external world changes, and yes, you might need to adapt products and how you market your products, but your branding, I don't believe, ever changes. When you've got a very strong foundation of why you are in business and why you do what you do, the company can change around that and above that, but I think fundamentally that isn't affected. The way you produce your products or sell your products, yes, of course, with technology, with other concerns environmentally, but yeah, it fundamentally stay the same. Your values, for sure.
I can see the value in that. That clearly, if fundamentally you, the organization, have a set of values, a mission, a vision, then that will weather most storms, and your products and services will flex to suit the environment in which you are operating. But of course, one of the challenges from an internal perspective is if you're a solopreneur, or you're a partnership, or you're a small organization of 5 to 10 people, I think it's almost inevitable that your culture and your values are going to change as you become an organization of 1,000 or 10,000, because culture is a function of the people within an organization. If there are 5 people in the room, there's a culture. If 2 leave and 2 different people come in, the culture has changed. Culture is a function of people. So if you're a 10,000 people business, I suspect to a certain extent, your culture, your values, philosophy may change unless they are genuinely clones of the first 5 founders. I mean, what's your experience of branding and marketing for those organizations that are on a growth trajectory?
So yeah, really interesting. I think what you said about how the original founders and their mission, vision, and values do they change? I suppose the key is to keep them consistent. If you're successful at growing and those visions are serving you well, it is about anybody who you bring on board
Mhm.
needs to align to those, and that's where with a strong brand it does help with recruitment as well. People want to work for companies that they share and align with. It's and having a strong brand, people will join companies knowing what they're about, having a good idea what their culture is internally, and it's not just a facade. It's not just that exterior visual identity. Um, what we say, it's got to be ingrained within the culture of the company and go throughout the company. They obviously sometimes you do need to make those changes, and that needs to be seriously considered and looked at, and the different repercussions that can be found from making those changes. But if it's the right thing to do, it needs to be handled quite delicately. How it is rolled out is really key, and getting that buy-in from your internal stakeholders is such an important step. So it can be done. It can be difficult and a little bit uncomfortable at times, but if those changes need to be made, and they need to be made, and they shouldn't be taken lightly, that's for sure.
You make a really good point about brand not necessarily being exclusively about the products and services that you provide to customers and clients, but it's actually also about talent acquisition and the people that you recruit. And therefore, brand and its alignment with culture and behavior, very powerful link. When we're looking at talent acquisition, then how important is brand then in the induction process? How do we bring people? Do we literally find somebody who perfectly fits our brand, or is there an element where we find close fits and then there's education and other types of mechanisms to help them understand, assimilate, adopt, and live the brand?
Yeah, I think it's a balance, isn't it? It's you. I don't think you can hold out for the perfect brand and ambassador. And is anybody perfectly aligned with any company that they ever join? You pick someone who has the relevant skills and knowledge, and try and determine where their values lie, and having those set out in a brand guideline, a brand book, and rolling that out through the business internally. Um, they will. I think they'll soon identify whether or not they're on board with those values and whether they can fit into that brand. And if they're not, I think they'll quickly be found out, and or they'll find out themselves, and maybe this isn't the company for me, and they look for somewhere else that's more aligned to their vision and values. So it's a fine balancing act, but I think in the initial phases, if you say this is who we are and this is what we believe, people can decide for themselves if that is something that they can get on board with, and if it's not, they will go and hopefully find a company that they will go and do good work with. But you need to be able to say there's no point in putting across one facade, and then they get in there and it's not what you're actually all about. So it's just about honesty, transparency, and real sort of having those sort of moral judgments made and set out. And yeah, I think it helps everybody know where they are and what they stand for.
And one of the things that comes from that is this idea that brand is very much about belonging and fitting in and almost feeling at home. You know, you fit, it works, it's instinctive. You're in the right place, you're doing the right things, you're thriving and flourishing. But I also think at the same time, we often belong to many things. You know, we may belong to our local community, but we also may be a follower of football, but we're also a follower of other things, sports, hobbies, professional interests, social groups. And so then you start getting into kind of weird tensions. I mean, let me be challenging here. It's probably not a fair example thought of on the fly, but can you be passionate about your Porsche and at the same time be absolutely part of the green community? That there are interesting dilemmas where we're being tugged both ways, and we obviously can belong to both. I don't doubt there are people that do, but it can be interesting actually. Which group do you identify more closely with? Which thing is more persuasive? Um, what is your experience? I suppose to an element, it's this thing about brand loyalty and how that affects your decision making.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we are all human beings. We all have different emotions and attachments, and they change and evolve over time. Of course, they do. Um, I think from a sort of employee side, staffing side, you can work for a company that has a brand and values that differ from your own slightly, but then I suppose that's your own sort of personal brand and belief system. But whilst you're working for that company, if you've got to be able to buy into that culture and those beliefs and values. As far as changing over time and evolving, I think it's natural, and some companies do require a rebrand at some points. Yeah, I think when there's really conflicting beliefs, it's not going to work. Maybe, and it could be very very difficult and uncomfortable. But I think there can be differences without too much problem as long as they are clearly defined and everybody's on board with them, I suppose, in their different roles.
And I think this potential for internal conflict is really interesting because, of course, increasingly we're embracing diversity and inclusion. And you touched on there the idea of personal brand. But of course, you'll have diversity and inclusion and a personal brand, but you may be all working for the same organization that has a corporate brand. And so we have to sort of manage that in a way that says, okay, at home, this is my set of values. At work, I'm prepared to compromise here, here, and here, perhaps. I find that really interesting. And, if people approached you about their personal brand, but they're working in an organization that has a corporate brand, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, so and that's exactly what it is a conversation and finding out where those lines are drawn. I believe you don't, as a corporation, you have your brand, you have your values that are very clearly stated, you have a culture, but you don't want to uh, remove any personality from your employees. Also, fundamentally, they are people doing a job, invariably working with other people and personalities, and you need that connection, that human connection. So whilst the corporate brand is out there doing its thing, and this is how you behave as a business, you don't want to remove any personality from those employees outside of work, as long as I don't believe if it's impacting the business. I think it's great that people embrace who they are and their personalities and bring their own diverse opinions and thoughts to work, and as long as they're expressed in a respectful way and don't impact the corporate brand publicly, I think it's only a healthy thing, healthy conversations to be had, different opinions. You get to look at the world in a slightly different place, a slightly different way, from a slightly different angle, see it from a different viewpoint, put yourself in different people's shoes, and I just think that's healthy and is a good thing for people to do.
I wholly agree and support what you say there. I mean, what can we therefore learn from when it goes wrong? And I think perhaps the organization for whom everything appears to have gone wrong very quickly was the UK's most trusted brand 10 years ago, without doubt, was the post office. And now it seems to unravel completely, not necessarily quickly, um, but I mean, it is an organization where protecting the brand, it would appear from the current inquiry, was more important than anything else and resulted in really some dysfunctional outcomes. I mean, what can we learn from that?
Yeah, it's a big one for sure. I mean, there were some catastrophic errors in judgment made at the time. And I suppose an element was to protect the brand of Royal Mail, and mistakes were made. I think it's how they react now that this has come out. I think there were individuals making these calls on behalf of the brand. I think on a day to day basis, people know that it's not your 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 postie that's delivering your mail that's made these errors in judgment. And I think they need to really sort of take it on board and reassess and reevaluate where it went wrong and how it doesn't happen again. There's a long road ahead for sure for them to sort of, if they can bring it back to where they were those years ago. They're in a very difficult place, I think, from a competitive market anyway. But they have an obligation to deliver mail and they have to continue. There's no way they're not going anywhere, but it's how they react to the scandal and come forward to really start to rebuild. But that's where it's going to be. It's going to be rebuilding that brand from the ground up and making sure it never happens again.
And I'm interested in that in part. I mean, it really is a poster child for the worst way of handling situations. But there are other organizations that have faced existential issues around their brand choices, and perhaps Volkswagen and Dieselgate is another example. But what's really interesting is Volkswagen has survived this. Indeed, Dieselgate is a function of history. It's not something that remains an existential threat. People still buy their cars, the products are still favored. So it is really interesting that some organizations can get it really badly wrong and maybe not survive, and others can. Why might that be?
Yeah, I think the way you deal with these corporate crisis and this negativity around it is very, very important. How quickly you react. I think Volkswagen came out, held their hands up that they'd been caught out, and were prepared to work through any sort of fines or sanctions imposed upon them. And it seemed to blow over exceptionally quickly. I think the difference between the post office is how this was so underhandedly dealt with for so many years historically. The repercussions of the scandal are so hugely felt in individuals and the sub postmasters and the hell that they've gone through, I guess. But yeah, VW have seemed to have held their hands up, and it has sort of started to blow over. Why that is in comparison, I'm not entirely sure if it was how they reacted in the very early days, but yeah, it seems not to have impacted them as heavily at all.
I think part of that comes down to a really interesting fundamental. We recognize the importance of trust. And, through this conversation, I recognize how heavily linked trust is to brand. They are not equally important and separate. They are completely intertwined. And I find that really interesting because, of course, where we trust, again, there's a potential to bypass our critical thinking and say, look, I know them, I trust the brand, I'm going to make a decision. And we've discussed a few examples where perhaps that has not served us well. But actually, on the whole, it does serve us well. It makes the companies thrive. We purchase on the strength of a brand, not just because of the human connection, but actually it is a proxy for trust and say, well, I think it's going to be solid and reliable. It is, after all, for example, a German car.
Yes.
Um, I'm really interested in that element of trust. And you talk actually an awful lot about how important that connection is with the founders of the organization, with the beliefs of the organization, with the customers, the clients, and the staff. It really is about, or it strikes me as being about fostering trust. I mean, what does trust mean for you in sales and marketing?
So the trust you build with a customer on delivering a good service or product is only there as long as you keep doing it.
Mhm.
Consistency. You have to be consistent. Go back to the Red Bull example of their brand. They are consistent. They don't just say, "We give you wings." They go out and they embody that extreme lifestyle. They support sports that other brands wouldn't touch. They're too small. They're too niche. They're living it. Again, Nike, Just Do It. They of course have the elite athletes, Usain Bolt, sporting their goods, but they are also for your average person who's going out trying to stay fit and healthy. They are just doing it. They're getting out there. So it's consistency and reliability and doing that for your customers and not just abandoning them or changing just because it suits or that's where a quick win is. Brand is all about the long game. I'm not a big fan of the term quick win. It's an investment, and some people think it costs an awful lot, but if you get it right, it pays dividends in the long run. You are investing in the future of your company. If people are there just to flip a business, maybe they might try and do a quick brand job to sort of paint over some cracks and and give the impression we're all singing, we're all dancing, we're doing this when behind the scenes they're not. But companies that really want to last and some longevity, brand is a great investment to value your customers and your company and your staff for the long term.
Ali, this has been a fascinating, rich, and rewarding conversation. And it's really interesting, the point that you make, that it's pretty pervasive. It's about your products and your services. It's about your people. It's about your clients. It's about the perception. It's both internal and external. It's both an emotional connection, but it's also alignment with the actual product. It is rich, diverse, and interesting. And you have made this rich, diverse, and interesting conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Tim. It's been great to talk as always, and yeah, it's something that I'm very very passionate about, and it's all about these conversations, having these conversations, and until you do, you maybe don't understand, like anything, the nuances and the depth that it can go to. So, thank you for the opportunity.